They called her Ruth, the slave nurse on the Beaumont plantation. Her hands were steady, her eyes quiet, her life bound to tending the very man who once whipped her child bloody. When the master, Augustus Beaumont, was thrown from his horse and broken in body, he had no choice but to trust her care. But what he didn't see was the powder she mixed into his bandages, the poison that turned healing into death, drop by drop, stitch by stitch. By his bedside, she smiled with silence while his body wasted away. And when his brother Horace came to claim power, Ruth faced a question far darker. Could she stop at one life, or would her vengeance consume them all? This is the story of the slave nurse who mixed poison into the bandages and slowly killed her master in his bed, and of the night a woman turned mercy into a weapon. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the plantation. Sweat dripped from the brows of the enslaved people as they bent over cotton plants, their fingers raw and bleeding. No one dared to stop, even to wipe away the sweat that stung their eyes. The overseer's whip cracked occasionally, a reminder of what would happen if they slowed. Samuel, 12 years old and already working in the fields, straightened his back for just a moment to ease the burning pain. His thin shirt stuck to the half-healed wounds that crisscrossed his back. 3 weeks had passed since Master Augustus had ordered him whipped for dropping a bucket of water. The thunder of hooves interrupted the steady rhythm of work. Heads turned slightly, careful not to draw attention. A hunting party rode along the edge of the cotton field, Master Augustus at the front on his massive black stallion. The horse pranced nervously, sensing its rider's cruelty. Suddenly, a rabbit darted across the path. The stallion reared up, its front hooves pawing the air. Augustus yanked hard on the reins, shouting curses. The horse twisted violently, throwing Augustus from the saddle. His body hit the ground with a sickening crack, followed by a scream that cut through the hot air. "Get Ruth!" someone shouted. "The master's hurt." Samuel ran toward the slave quarters before anyone could stop him. His mother was the plantation's nurse, respected even by the whites for her healing skills. He found her grinding herbs in their small cabin. "Mama, the master fell from his horse. They're calling for you." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, her face instantly becoming a mask. Samuel recognized it, the careful, emotionless expression she wore whenever dealing with the white folks. "Bring my medicine bag," she said quietly. By the time they reached Augustus, a crowd had gathered. White overseers shouted conflicting orders, while the hunting party stood uselessly around their fallen leader. The enslaved people hung back, faces carefully blank despite the scene before them. Augustus lay twisted on the ground, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood soaked through his fine riding pants where bone had broken through skin. His face was ashen beneath his sunburn, eyes wild with pain and fury. "You!" he snarled when he saw Ruth. "Fix this now!" Ruth knelt beside him, her movements precise and measured. Samuel placed her medicine bag within reach, then stepped back, keeping his eyes lowered. "The leg is broken badly, Master," Ruth said, her voice neutral as she examined the wound. "You shouldn't be moved without—" "I will not lie in the dirt like an animal," Augustus roared, then winced as pain shot through him. "Get me to the house." 4 men fashioned a stretcher from jackets and tree branches. Augustus screamed with each step they took toward the big house, cursing Ruth when she suggested they move more carefully. Samuel followed at a distance, carrying his mother's supplies. He had never been inside the main house before. Its grand white columns and wide porches seemed to mock the tiny cabins where they lived. Inside, the house was cool and dark. Expensive furniture and gleaming floors stretched before them. The men carried Augustus up the sweeping staircase to his bedroom, leaving bloody footprints on the polished wood. "Everyone out!" Augustus gasped as they laid him on his massive four-poster bed. "Except you," he pointed at Ruth. "And boy, fetch clean water and linens." Samuel hurried to obey, finding his way to the kitchen where a house slave showed him where to get what was needed. When he returned, his mother was cutting away Augustus's pant leg with steady hands. The wound looked even worse in the bedroom's light. White bone jutted through torn flesh. Augustus's face had gone gray, his breathing shallow. "He needs laudanum for the pain," Ruth said quietly. "It's in my bag." Samuel handed her the small brown bottle. She measured drops into a glass of water and held it to Augustus's lips. He gulped it desperately. "More!" he demanded. "Too much will stop your heart, master," Ruth replied, her voice flat. Augustus glared at her through pain-glazed eyes. "Do you think I don't know what you people whisper? That you wouldn't all celebrate my death?" Ruth's face remained impassive. "I'm here to heal, master." As the laudanum took effect, Augustus's eyes grew heavy. Ruth cleaned the wound with careful movements, picking out dirt and debris. Samuel stood by, handing her cloths and pouring fresh water when needed. The shadows lengthened across the room as afternoon turned to evening. The house grew quiet except for Augustus's labored breathing. House slaves came occasionally, peering fearfully at their fallen master before hurrying away. Night fell. Lamps were lit around the bedroom, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Augustus drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling orders and threats. Ruth sat by his bedside, grinding herbs in a small mortar. The steady rhythm of stone against stone filled the quiet room. Samuel sat in the corner, exhausted but afraid to leave his mother alone. "Boy!" Augustus suddenly called, his voice slurred. "Come here." Samuel approached cautiously, keeping his eyes down. "Turn around," Augustus commanded. Samuel obeyed, feeling the master's eyes on his scarred back through the thin shirt. "Remember that, boy?" Augustus's voice held a strange pride. "That's what happens to thieves. I'm fair, though. Could have taken your hand instead." "Yes, master," Samuel whispered, remembering the beating he'd received for supposedly stealing food he hadn't taken. "Go back to your corner." Augustus waved him away. Ruth's hand trembled slightly as she ground her herbs. Her eyes lingered on Samuel's back, on the scars visible through his worn shirt. Then her gaze moved to Augustus, vulnerable now in his expensive bed with bloodied sheets. Taking a deep breath, Ruth steadied her hand. From a hidden pocket in her skirt, she withdrew a small pouch. Glancing at Augustus to ensure he wasn't watching, she added a pinch of dark powder to the herbs she'd been grinding. The mixture turned slightly darker, but in the dim firelight, the change was barely noticeable. With methodical care, Ruth began preparing fresh bandages, working the poisoned herbs into the cloth that would soon touch Augustus's open wound. Dawn crept through the heavy curtains of Augustus Beaumont's bedchamber, painting thin strips of golden light across the polished floor. Ruth had barely slept, keeping vigil in a hard wooden chair beside his massive bed. Her back ached, but her mind remained sharp, calculating each careful move. Augustus stirred beneath the fine linen sheets, now stained with sweat and blood. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing labored. He opened his eyes, immediately wincing at the light. "Water," he croaked, his voice stripped of its usual command. "Give me water, woman." Ruth rose without a word, pouring water from a silver pitcher into a matching cup. She supported his head as he drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin onto his nightshirt. "The pain is unbearable," Augustus groaned, falling back against the pillows. "My leg feels like it's on fire. I need to change your bandages, master," Ruth said, her voice calm and professional. "The wounds must be cleaned to prevent rot." Augustus gritted his teeth. "Get on with it, then." Ruth gathered her supplies on a small table beside the bed. Clean cloths, a bowl of fresh water, and her special poultices. From her apron pocket, she took a small jar of salve she'd prepared during the night after Samuel had finally fallen asleep in the corner. With practiced hands, Ruth began unwrapping the blood-soaked bandages from Augustus's leg. The wound looked angry, red and swollen where bone had torn through flesh. Augustus hissed in pain as the last layer of cloth pulled away from the raw edges. "Be careful, damn you!" he snapped. "Yes, master," Ruth replied, her face a perfect mask of subservience. She cleaned the wound with gentle strokes, washing away dried blood and the remnants of yesterday's medicine. Augustus watched her through pain-narrowed eyes. "You have skilled hands," he admitted grudgingly, between gasps of pain. "Your kind is good for something after all." Ruth nodded without looking up. "Thank you, master." From the table she took the fresh poultices she'd prepared, herbs ground to paste and spread on clean cloths. What Augustus couldn't see was the dark powder mixed with the healing herbs, the same powder she'd added last night. Ruth's mother had taught her about this plant that grew deep in the swamps, warned her never to touch it with bare hands or let it near an open wound. "It makes the blood turn against itself," her mother had whispered years ago. Ruth pressed the poisoned poultice directly onto the open wound. Augustus yelped, then settled as the herbs began numbing the pain. "That's better," he muttered. "Whatever you're using, it works." "An old remedy, master," Ruth said, as she began wrapping clean bandages around his leg. These too had been prepared in advance, soaked in a weaker solution of the same poison, then dried. Every layer that touched his wound carried Ruth's silent vengeance. When she finished, Ruth cleaned her hands in the water bowl and prepared a cup of tea from the pot, kept warming by the fireplace. She added honey to mask any bitter taste, then helped Augustus drink it. "You'll need to rest, master," she said. "Movement will only make the break worse." Augustus scowled. "How long until I can ride again? The fields need overseeing." "Many weeks, master. Perhaps months." "Months!" Augustus slammed his fist against the mattress. "Impossible. The slaves will grow lazy without proper supervision. Already, they must be celebrating my condition." Ruth lowered her eyes. "I wouldn't know about that, master." "Don't lie to me," Augustus snarled. "I know how your people think. Send for Grayson. The overseer must double his vigilance while I am confined to this damned bed." "Yes, master. I'll send word after I prepare your breakfast." In the kitchen downstairs, Ruth found Samuel already at work. He'd risen early to fetch fresh eggs and milk, eager to make himself useful and stay close to his mother. "How is he?" Samuel whispered as he handed Ruth a basket of eggs. "In pain," she answered simply. "But he'll live, for now." The kitchen was filled with house slaves preparing the day's meals. They moved quietly, exchanging glances when Ruth entered. One older woman named Martha stepped closer as Ruth cracked eggs into a bowl. "They say the master's leg is badly broken," Martha murmured. "Will he walk again?" Ruth shrugged, keeping her voice low. "The bone pierced through the skin. Such wounds often fester." Word of Augustus's condition had spread quickly through the quarters. As Samuel carried a tray of bread to the counter, he overheard two young women whispering by the pantry. "Master can't use the whip himself now," one said. "Don't fool yourself," the other replied. "Grayson enjoys it more anyway." As if summoned by his name, the overseer appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mr. Grayson was a wiry man with cold eyes and a perpetual sneer. He surveyed the kitchen, his gaze settling on Ruth as she prepared Augustus's breakfast tray. "How's our master this morning?" he asked, stepping closer to examine the food. "Fevered and in pain," Ruth answered. "He asked for you." Grayson nodded, then reached down to pick up Ruth's herb pouch, where it sat beside her mortar and pestle. He turned it over in his hands, sniffing at it curiously. "Interesting smells," he remarked. "What do you put in these concoctions of yours?" Ruth kept her face neutral as she took back the pouch. "Just herbs for healing, sir. Plants from the woods and garden." Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. I've never paid much attention to your skills before. Perhaps I should. Ruth focused on arranging Augustus's breakfast, not meeting the overseer's gaze. I should bring this up before it gets cold. Throughout the day, Ruth tended to Augustus, changing his bandages twice more, each time applying fresh poison to his wounds. By evening, his fever had risen, and his breathing had grown more labored. Sweat soaked his nightshirt, despite the cool air flowing through the open windows. After the household gathered for evening prayers, with Augustus notably absent, Ruth prepared him for the night. She spooned broth between his cracked lips and washed his face with a cool cloth. "Why am I so weak?" Augustus muttered, his voice barely audible. "The pain. It's spreading from my leg." "Fever often comes with such injuries, Master," Ruth said. "Your body is fighting to heal." Augustus's eyes fluttered closed. "Don't leave me tonight. I don't trust anyone else." "I'll be here, Master," Ruth promised, watching as he fell into a restless sleep. When she was certain he wouldn't wake, Ruth stepped outside onto the balcony connected to his room. She needed just a moment away from the sick room, a chance to breathe air that wasn't heavy with the smell of blood and sweat. The night was clear, stars scattered across the dark sky like spilled salt. Ruth filled her lungs, letting the cool air wash away the day's tension. She touched the pouch of herbs at her waist, calculating how much poison remained and how much more she would need. "Beautiful night." The voice from the shadows startled her. Ruth turned to find Mr. Grayson leaning against the wall, his face half hidden in darkness. She hadn't heard him approach. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. Grayson's eyes drifted to the herb pouch at her waist. "Curious how a slave learns so much about medicine," he said. "Curious indeed." Ruth clasped her hands to stop them from trembling. "My mother taught me, sir." She learned from her mother before her. "And what exactly did they teach you?" Grayson pushed himself away from the wall, stepping closer. His eyes never left the pouch of herbs. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep gongs echoing through the quiet house. Ruth had dozed off in a chair beside Augustus's bed, her chin resting on her chest. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting the room in shadows. "The horses! Stop them! They're trampling me!" Ruth jolted awake at Augustus's shouts. He thrashed in his bed, arms flailing wildly, face contorted in fear. His nightshirt clung to his body, soaked through with sweat. "Master, you're dreaming," Ruth said, hurrying to his side. She placed a hand on his forehead and drew back in surprise. His skin burned like hot iron. Augustus's eyes flew open, but they were unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. "Get them off me! The hooves! The hooves!" "There are no horses, Master," Ruth said firmly. "You're in your bed. You fell yesterday, remember?" She grabbed a cloth from the water basin and wrung it out, then placed it on his forehead. Augustus continued to twitch and shake, his muscles spasming beneath her touch. The poison was beginning its slow work, seeping into his blood from the wounds on his leg. "Water," he gasped, his voice raspy. "I need water." Ruth turned toward the pitcher, finding it empty. She opened the bedroom door and nearly collided with Samuel, who stood in the hallway with wide, worried eyes. "I heard shouting," Samuel whispered. "The master has a fever," Ruth said. "I need fresh water and more cloths." Samuel nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Ruth returned to Augustus's side, adjusting his pillows and straightening the twisted sheets. His leg was swollen to nearly twice its normal size now, the skin around the bandage tight and shiny. Samuel returned quickly with a pitcher of cool water and clean cloths. He set them on the bedside table, watching Augustus with cautious eyes. "Help me change his bandages," Ruth said. Samuel hesitated but moved to the foot of the bed. Together they unwrapped the soiled dressings from Augustus's leg. The wound looked worse. Angry red streaks now spread outward from the break, and a yellowish fluid seeped from the torn flesh. Ruth reached for her pouch of herbs and began mixing a fresh poultice in a small wooden bowl. Samuel watched as she worked, grinding dried leaves and adding drops of water to form a paste. When Samuel looked away to check on Augustus, Ruth slipped an extra leaf from a hidden pocket in her apron, dark green and waxy, with jagged edges. Samuel turned back just as she dropped it into the mixture. His eyes widened slightly. "What's that plant?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Ruth gave him a sharp look, then glanced meaningfully at Augustus, who had fallen into a restless sleep again. She motioned Samuel closer. "Never speak of what you see me do," she whispered against his ear. "Never ask questions where others might hear. Understand?" Samuel swallowed hard and nodded. Ruth squeezed his arm gently. "This is our secret," she continued, her voice so low Samuel had to strain to hear. "Our protection." Together they applied the fresh poultice to Augustus's wound and wrapped it with clean bandages. By the time they finished, the master had fallen deeper into his fevered sleep, occasional moans escaping his lips. "Go back to bed," Ruth told Samuel. "I'll watch over him tonight." Samuel hesitated. "Will he die?" Ruth's face remained expressionless. "That's in God's hands now." The rest of the night passed slowly. Ruth dozed in her chair, waking whenever Augustus cried out or needed water. By dawn, his condition had worsened. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his skin had taken on a yellowish tinge. As the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, Martha the cook knocked softly on the door. "How is he?" she asked, peering at the still form on the bed. "Not well," Ruth answered truthfully. "The fever grows stronger." Martha crossed herself, words already spreading through the quarters. "Everyone's talking about the master's condition." "What are they saying?" Ruth asked, keeping her voice neutral. Martha glanced over her shoulder before answering. "Some are praying for his recovery." She paused. "Others aren't." By midday, the news of Augustus's decline had spread across the entire plantation. House slaves moved quietly, ears alert for any news. Field slaves exchanged glances as they worked, whispers passing between them during brief moments when the overseers turned away. In the kitchen, Ruth prepared a thin broth for Augustus, while the other house slaves moved around her, their curiosity poorly concealed. "They say his skin's turned yellow," one young woman murmured. "Yellow means the liver's failing," an older man replied. "My old master went that way. Yellow skin, then gone within a week." "Hush," Martha warned them. "Walls have ears." Outside, Grayson paced the porch, periodically sending messengers to neighboring plantations. Ruth watched through the window as he scribbled a letter, his face tense with worry. Without Augustus to direct him, the overseer seemed uncertain, caught between maintaining his authority and preparing for what might come next. After forcing a few spoonfuls of broth between Augustus's lips, Ruth stood by the bedroom window, stretching her tired back. From this vantage point, she could see most of the front yard and the long driveway leading to the main road. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn when Ruth noticed a cloud of dust in the distance. She squinted, making out the shape of a carriage approaching rapidly, pulled by 4 matching black horses. Several house slaves gathered on the porch as the carriage rolled to a stop. Grayson hurried down the steps to meet it, his back straight and hat in hand. The carriage door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the family resemblance, the same tall frame and broad shoulders as Augustus, but leaner, with sharper features. Horace Beaumont, Augustus's younger brother, had arrived. Ruth watched as Horace surveyed the plantation, his calculating gaze taking in every detail. The slaves gathered in small clusters, Grayson's deferential posture, the main house with its white columns. His eyes moved methodically, missing nothing. Unlike his brother's explosive temper, Horace's power lay in his cold assessment. Where Augustus would shout and threaten, Horace simply observed, his silence more terrifying than any outburst. Ruth's fingers tightened on the windowsill as Horace's gaze lifted to the second floor. For a moment, she felt certain he was looking directly at her, as if he could sense who was responsible for his brother's condition. The spell broke when Grayson gestured toward the house, and Horace followed him up the steps. Ruth stepped back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Augustus's brother had arrived, and with him, a new danger. The bedroom door creaked open. Horace Beaumont stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. He paused, handkerchief pressed to his nose, eyes narrowing at the sight of his brother. "Good Lord," Horace muttered, stepping slowly into the room. "The stench is unbearable." Augustus lay still on the bed, his skin waxy and yellow in the afternoon light. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Sweat soaked the sheets beneath him, despite the cool air flowing through the open window. "Brother," Horace said, approaching the bedside. No response came from Augustus, except a low moan. Horace's lips tightened into a thin line as he studied the bandaged leg, the swollen flesh visible even beneath the wrappings. "Who tends to him?" Horace demanded, turning toward the door where Grayson waited. "The slave woman. Ruth," Grayson answered. "She has some skill with herbs and healing. Augustus has kept her as his nurse for years." "Fetch her," Horace ordered. "I want to know exactly what she's been doing to my brother." Grayson nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Horace circled the bed, inspecting Augustus from every angle. He lifted his brother's limp hand, noting the yellow tinge beneath the fingernails, then let it drop back to the mattress, with little care. When the door opened again, Ruth entered with her head bowed, hands folded before her. She kept her eyes lowered, but she could feel Horace's gaze cutting through her like a knife. "You're the nurse?" Horace asked, his voice cold and precise. "Yes, Master Horace," Ruth answered softly. "Look at me when I address you," he commanded. Ruth raised her eyes slowly, careful to keep her face blank. Where Augustus was all fire and shouting, Horace was ice, calculating, patient, observant. His eyes lingered on her face too long, searching for something Ruth couldn't name. Distrust already stirred beneath his surface. "Explain to me your methods," Horace said, gesturing toward Augustus. "My brother writes that you possess remarkable healing abilities, yet I find him at death's door." "The master's injuries were severe, sir," Ruth explained. "The bone broke through the skin. Such wounds often lead to fever." "And what remedies have you applied?" Horace moved closer, forcing Ruth to hold her ground despite wanting to step back. "Willow bark tea for the pain and fever," Ruth answered, weaving careful lies with truths. "Poultices of comfrey and calendula for the wound. Broth to keep up his strength." "Herbs," Horace repeated, the word dripping with suspicion. "Simple plants to treat such grievous injuries?" "It's all we have, Master Horace," Ruth said. "The doctor from town hasn't arrived yet." Horace circled around her, the way a hawk circles prey. "And where do you gather these herbs? Who taught you their uses?" "My mother before she passed, sir. She tended the slaves on Master Walker's plantation before your father purchased me." The lie came easily. Her mother had indeed been a healer, but Ruth had learned about poisons from an old woman who'd been sold away years ago. Horace stopped directly in front of Ruth, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his clothes. "Show me your herbs." Ruth retrieved her small bundle of permitted medicines from beside Augustus's bed. The innocent herbs she displayed openly. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing dried leaves, flowers, and roots. Horace picked through them with 2 fingers, as if touching something distasteful. "These look like common weeds." "God puts healing in simple things, Master," Ruth said, lowering her eyes again. Horace didn't seem convinced. He dropped the herbs back onto the cloth. "You will continue to tend my brother, but you will report his condition to me morning and night. If he worsens, I'll hold you responsible." "Yes, Master Horace." "And open these curtains fully," Horace ordered. "The darkness only encourages disease." After Horace left, Ruth remained by Augustus's side, changing his bandages and feeding him sips of water. The house grew quiet as night fell, with only the occasional creak of floorboards as slaves completed their evening chores. Ruth carried a tray of dirty bandages toward the kitchen when a hand shot out from a darkened doorway, grabbing her arm. The tray clattered to the floor as Ruth found herself face to face with Grayson, the overseer. "Careful now," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't want to wake the house." Ruth bent to pick up the fallen items, but Grayson's boot stepped on the cloth, preventing her. "Leave it," he ordered. "I've been watching you, Ruth." She straightened, keeping her eyes down. "I need to finish my duties, Mr. Grayson." "Your duties," he repeated with a smirk. "Including those secret herbs you keep hidden in your quarters?" Ruth's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face calm. "I don't know what you mean, sir." Grayson leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't play dumb with me. I saw you gathering plants by the creek last month. Plants that don't grow in the garden. I've been in your quarters while you tended the master. You had no right." "I have every right," he cut her off. "Every slave, every cabin, every secret on this plantation is mine to know." Ruth stayed silent, calculating her options. Denial would only make things worse. "Now," Grayson continued, "I could tell the new master about your little collection. Horace Beaumont strikes me as a man who doesn't appreciate secrets." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Or we could come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Ruth asked, already knowing the answer. "Simple things. Extra food set aside for me. Information about what's said in the big house. Complete obedience when I call for you." His fingers traced up her arm, "and absolute silence about our arrangement." Ruth pulled her arm away. "And if I refuse?" Grayson's smile vanished. "Then perhaps your boy Samuel needs closer supervision in the fields. Accidents happen to careless children all the time." The threat sliced through Ruth like a knife. "Leave my son out of this." "That's entirely up to you," Grayson said, stepping back. "Consider carefully, Ruth. Your herbs, your son, your life, all hanging by a very thin thread." He walked away, leaving Ruth trembling in the dark hallway. Later that night, Ruth sat on the edge of her small pallet in the cramped quarters she shared with Samuel. Her son slept peacefully beside her, unaware of the new danger threatening them. Moonlight streamed through the single window, illuminating his face, so innocent, so vulnerable. Ruth reached beneath a loose floorboard and pulled out a small leather pouch, carefully hidden from prying eyes. She opened it, revealing dark leaves and dried berries that looked harmless but carried death in their veins. She stared at the poison, weighing it in her palm as if measuring its worth against the cost of using it. Outside, voices drifted through the thin walls. Ruth moved silently to the window and peered out. Horace and Grayson stood by a torch near the main house, their heads bent close in conversation. The flickering light cast their faces in sharp relief. Horace's cold, assessing gaze and Grayson's eager expression as they exchanged low words. Two new enemies where before there had been one. Ruth clutched the pouch of poison tighter, knowing her simple plan had just become far more dangerous. Morning dew still clung to the plants as Ruth knelt in the garden, carefully selecting herbs for Augustus's daily treatments. The sun had barely risen above the tree line, casting long shadows across the damp soil. She worked methodically, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite her troubled mind. The sound of boots on gravel made her shoulders tense. Ruth kept her head down, hoping whoever approached would pass by, but the footsteps stopped directly behind her. "Working early, I see." Grayson's voice sliced through the morning quiet. Ruth didn't turn around. "Master Augustus needs fresh herbs for his morning treatment." "Of course he does," Grayson said, circling around until he stood in front of her. "Though I wonder which herbs are for healing and which are for other purposes." Ruth finally looked up, keeping her face carefully blank. Grayson stood with his hands on his hips, a smirk playing at his lips as he towered over her kneeling form. "Have you considered our arrangement?" he asked, his voice casual, as though discussing the weather. "I have nothing to consider, Mr. Grayson," Ruth replied softly. "I only tend to the master, as I'm told." Grayson crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. "Let's not play games, Ruth. I know what you're doing. I've seen your special herbs, the ones you don't show to anyone." He plucked a leaf from her basket, twirling it between his fingers. Innocent plants in plain sight, dangerous ones hidden away. Clever. Ruth's heart hammered in her chest, but years of hiding her emotions helped her maintain her calm expression. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Grayson said, dropping the leaf back into her basket. "And unless you want Horace to know about your little collection, you'll do exactly as I say." Ruth remained silent, weighing her options. Denial would only provoke him. "I want extra food. The good kind from the big house kitchen. Set aside for me daily," Grayson continued. "I want to know everything you hear while tending Augustus, what Horace plans, what visitors say, all of it." "I'm just a slave," Ruth said. "They don't speak freely around me." "They speak more freely than you think," Grayson countered. "People forget slaves have ears, and you'll use yours for me now." Ruth clutched her basket tighter. "And if I refuse?" Grayson's smile disappeared. "Then I tell Horace about your herbs. And that boy of yours, Samuel, isn't it? He'll be moved to field work under my direct supervision." The mention of Samuel sent ice through Ruth's veins. "He's just a child. Old enough to feel the whip," Grayson said coldly. "Too many slaves have been coddled on this plantation. Horace agrees with me on that point. One word from me, and your boy will learn what real work means." Ruth looked down at her basket, her mind racing behind her calm exterior. "What you're asking could get me killed if I'm caught. And what you're doing would get you worse than killed," Grayson countered. "I've seen slaves burned alive for less." The garden fell silent except for bird song and the distant sounds of the plantation waking up. Ruth knew she had no choice. Not now, not yet. "I'll bring what food I can," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "And tell you what I hear." Grayson straightened, satisfaction spreading across his face. "Smart woman. I knew you'd see reason." He glanced around to ensure they were still alone. "I'll expect something by this evening. Leave it behind the smokehouse after dark." He walked away, his stride confident and unhurried. Ruth remained kneeling in the dirt, her face a mask of submission. But beneath that mask, hatred bloomed like the poisonous nightshade she gathered in secret, dark, potent, and deadly. When she was certain Grayson was gone, Ruth added a few more herbs to her basket and stood. As she walked toward the main house, her mind sorted through possibilities like seeds. Grayson had just made himself a target, but she couldn't act rashly. Augustus first, then Horace, and now Grayson. The list of those who threatened her son was growing longer. Inside the grand house, Augustus's condition had worsened overnight. The smell hit Ruth before she even entered his room, the sickly, sweet odor of festering flesh. She paused at the doorway, steeling herself before entering. Augustus lay twisted in sweat-soaked sheets, his skin mottled with yellow and gray patches. The broken leg had turned an angry red, with dark streaks climbing toward his hip. "Where have you been?" Horace demanded, rising from a chair beside the bed. "He's been calling for you since dawn." "Gathering fresh herbs, Master Horace," Ruth answered, setting her basket on the table. "The old ones lose their strength." "Fat lot of good they're doing," Horace sneered, gesturing toward his brother. "Look at him. He's worse by the day." Augustus's eyes fluttered open at the sound of voices. "Ruth?" he called weakly. "Is that you?" "I'm here, Master," Ruth said, approaching the bed. "Only she knows how to ease the pain Augustus mumbled to Horace. "Send for the doctor again." "Useless man. Ruth knows more." Horace's face darkened at his brother's praise of a slave. "The doctor will return tomorrow. In the meantime, she'll continue her treatments." He spat the last word as if it tasted bitter. Ruth began unwrapping Augustus's bandages, revealing the horror beneath. The broken bone still jutted against the skin, but now the flesh around it had begun to die, turning black at the edges. Augustus whimpered as the air touched his wound. "Incompetence," Horace hissed at Ruth. "How can it be this bad after weeks of your care?" "Such wounds often worsen before improving, Master Horace," Ruth explained quietly. "The body fights against itself." She prepared a fresh poultice, mixing the visible herbs with water while keeping her back to Horace. Under her breath, she whispered words only she could hear, as she added a pinch of powder from a hidden pocket in her apron. "What was that?" Horace asked sharply. "What did you say?" "A prayer, Master," Ruth lied smoothly. "For healing." Horace watched her with narrowed eyes as she applied the poultice to Augustus's leg and wrapped it in clean bandages. Augustus sighed as the mixture numbed his pain temporarily, unaware that beneath the comfort, death continued its slow work. "I'll return tonight to change the bandages again," Ruth said, gathering the soiled cloths. "See that you do," Horace replied coldly. "And Ruth, if he worsens further, your son will take the punishment. Remember that." Ruth lowered her eyes. "Yes, Master Horace." Evening fell over the plantation like a heavy blanket. Ruth returned to Augustus's room with fresh bandages and herbs, finding him alone and half-conscious. The fever had taken a stronger hold, making him delirious. He muttered names Ruth didn't recognize, his head rolling from side to side on the sweat-soaked pillow. "It burns," Augustus moaned as Ruth approached. "Make it stop." "Soon, Master," Ruth whispered, carefully removing the day's bandages. The wound looked worse, angry red spreading farther up his leg, the flesh around it turning dark. The poison was working slowly but surely, destroying him from within just as he had destroyed so many lives. Ruth applied a fresh poultice, this one containing a stronger dose of her secret powder. As she wrapped the clean bandages around his leg, she leaned close and whispered, "Soon." The word held all her hatred, all her years of suffering, all her plans for justice. Soon, Augustus would be gone. Soon she would turn her attention to Horace and Grayson. Soon her son might know safety. At the doorway, Samuel stood silently watching, his small face solemn in the lamplight. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. He had heard his mother's whisper, understood its meaning without needing explanation. Ruth's eyes met his across the room, a moment of perfect, terrible understanding passing between mother and son. Samuel's fists remained clenched, not in fear, but in solidarity with his mother's quiet rebellion. Too young to fight openly, but old enough to understand the war being waged in secret. A war fought with herbs and whispers instead of guns and shouts. Ruth nodded slightly to him, a signal to move away before anyone saw him. Samuel disappeared into the shadows of the hallway as silently as he had appeared, leaving Ruth alone with the dying master and her deepening plans for those who would threaten what little she had left to protect. Dawn broke over the plantation, turning the sky a pale pink. The air was still cool, but the promise of another sweltering day hung heavy. The quiet morning shattered when Augustus's screams tore through the house. "Ruth! Ruth!" His voice was hoarse, desperate. Ruth had been preparing herbs in the kitchen when she heard him. She grabbed her basket and hurried up the stairs, her face a careful mask of concern. Inside the master's bedroom, the stench hit her first, the unmistakable smell of rotting flesh. Augustus thrashed weakly on the bed, his nightshirt soaked with sweat. The sheets beneath his broken leg were stained dark red where blood had seeped through the bandages. "It's burning!" Augustus moaned. My leg! It's on fire! Ruth set her basket on the bedside table. Let me see, master. As she began unwrapping the bandages, Horace burst through the door, his face twisted with anger. What is that smell? He demanded, pressing a handkerchief to his nose. Good Lord! It's like a dead animal in here. The wound has worsened, Master Horace, Ruth explained calmly, continuing to remove the bandages. Sometimes this happens with bad breaks. When the last bandage came away, even Ruth had to fight to keep her expression neutral. The leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin around the break was black now, with angry red streaks climbing toward Augustus's hip. Yellow pus oozed from the wound, and the exposed bone looked gray instead of white. Horace turned away, gagging. This is beyond infection. This is gangrene, Ruth finished for him, her voice steady. The flesh is dying. Augustus whimpered, his eyes rolling with fever. Cut it off, he whispered. If you must, just make it stop. From the corner of the room, a low chuckle sounded. Grayson stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Never thought I'd see the mighty Augustus Beaumont begging, he remarked. Horace whirled on him. What are you doing in here? Get back to your duties. Grayson straightened but didn't leave. Just checking on the master's condition. The field hands are asking questions. They need to know who's in charge. His eyes slid to Ruth, a knowing smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. She avoided his gaze, busying herself with preparing a fresh poultice. I'm in charge, Horace snapped, and I'll have the doctor back today. This has gone on long enough? Ruth mixed herbs in a small bowl, adding water to make a paste. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing. The doctor might recognize poison, might see through her careful work. She needed to be cautious now. This will ease the pain until the doctor arrives, she said, applying the mixture to Augustus's leg. It contained no poison this time. She couldn't risk discovery. But the damage was already done. The poison from previous applications had worked its way deep into his blood. Augustus sighed as the herbs numbed his pain. Only Ruth knows how to eat, he mumbled. Only Ruth. Horace's face darkened at his brother's words. Finish up and open these windows. The stench is unbearable. After Horace stormed out, Grayson lingered, watching Ruth wrap fresh bandages around the festering leg. Interesting work you do, he said quietly. Healing and… what else, I wonder? Ruth tied off the bandage before answering. Just what the master requires of me. Of course. Grayson pushed himself away from the wall and approached the bed. He leaned in close to Ruth, his breath hot on her ear. Don't forget our arrangement. I expect fresh bread and meat tonight. Left where we discussed. She nodded once, keeping her eyes down. Good girl. Grayson patted her shoulder, his touch lingering unpleasantly. Our secret stays safe as long as you keep your end of the bargain. After he left, Ruth opened the windows to let in fresh air. Augustus had fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing shallow and rapid. She gathered her things and slipped out of the room. In the kitchen garden, she found Samuel pulling weeds as he'd been ordered to do. Making sure no one was watching, Ruth beckoned him over. Come, she whispered. I need to show you something. They walked to the edge of the woods that bordered the plantation. Ruth knelt beside a patch of unremarkable weeds and pointed. See this one? With the jagged leaves. This is important, she said softly. It looks like any other weed, but it's not. This is what I need most now. Samuel studied the plant carefully. What does it do? Ruth glanced around before answering. It brings sleep first, then fever. Then… She let the sentence hang unfinished. Understanding dawned in Samuel's young eyes. Like Master Augustus? Hush, Ruth warned. Never speak of such things. Just remember which plants to gather. She showed him 3 more herbs, explaining which parts were needed and how to hide them. When you gather these, bring them to me wrapped in a cloth, hidden in your shirt. Never let anyone see. Samuel nodded solemnly. I can do it, Mama. Good boy. Ruth touched his cheek gently. But be careful. If anyone asks, you're just pulling weeds. What about Mr. Grayson? Samuel asked, his voice dropping lower. I seen how he watches you. Ruth's face hardened. Mr. Grayson thinks he knows things. Let him think that for now. Is he going to hurt us? No, Ruth said firmly. I won't let that happen. But we must be careful and patient. That evening, Ruth left a bundle of food behind the smokehouse, as Grayson had demanded. The payment for his silence tasted bitter. But she had no choice. Not yet. The doctor came and went, shaking his head gravely at Augustus's condition. Amputation might have saved him weeks ago, he told Horace. Now the poison's in his blood. It's too late. Midnight found Ruth sitting beside Augustus's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest grow more labored with each passing hour. Samuel had sneaked in after the house went quiet, and now lay curled on a small pallet in the corner, finally asleep after fighting to keep his eyes open. Ruth moved from the chair to sit beside her son on the floor. She stroked his hair gently, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. In the flickering candlelight, Samuel's face looked peaceful, unburdened by the weight of their daily struggle. Just a little longer, Ruth whispered to her sleeping child. We must hold on just a little longer. Augustus moaned from the bed, lost in fever dreams. Ruth glanced at him, noting the gray pallor of his skin, the blue tinge of his lips. Death was coming for him. Slowly, but surely. Her patience would be rewarded. She continued stroking Samuel's hair, her voice barely audible even in the silent room. Soon, this will end, and then we face what comes next. But whatever happens, I will protect you. This I promise. The candle guttered, casting strange shadows across the walls. Ruth watched them dance, her mind already planning her next moves. Augustus would not last much longer. Then would come Horace's wrath, and Grayson's growing demands. She would need all her strength and cunning for what lay ahead. But for now, in this quiet midnight hour, she allowed herself a moment of peace, listening to her son's steady breathing and the death rattle beginning in Augustus's throat. The pale gray of early morning seeped through the curtains as Ruth placed a fresh cloth on Augustus's forehead. He hadn't slept more than minutes at a time through the night, his fevered ravings growing wilder with each passing hour. Now he clawed at his sheets, eyes wide, but seeing nothing in this world. The shadows, Augustus moaned, his voice cracked and dry. They're climbing the walls. Don't you see them? Lie still, Master, Ruth said, pressing him gently back against the pillows. Save your strength. Augustus grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. They're coming for me, Ruth. The black hands, all those I've punished. She pried his fingers loose and continued bathing his face. The fever had risen higher during the night. His skin burned against her touch, and the smell from his leg had grown so foul that even Ruth had to breathe through her mouth. Samuel had slipped away before dawn, warned by Ruth not to be found in the master's quarters when the house woke. The boy had learned caution beyond his years. The door burst open, and Horace stormed in, already dressed in his dark coat, despite the early hour. He stopped short at the sight of his brother. "Dear God," he whispered, the color draining from his face. Augustus no longer looked human. His cheeks had sunken into hollow pits, his lips cracked and bleeding. The sheets around his leg were stained black with blood and pus. He thrashed against the bed, mumbling incoherently. "What have you done to him?" Horace demanded, turning on Ruth. "Nothing but tend him, Master Horace," she answered, keeping her eyes down. "The infection has taken hold deep." "Lies!" Horace hissed, stepping closer. "My brother was strong as an ox 3 weeks ago. Now look at him." Before Ruth could respond, Augustus let out a terrible shriek. His back arched off the bed, his eyes bulging. "They're here!" he screamed, pointing at the empty corners of the room. "The dead have come for me!" Horace rushed to his brother's side, taking his hand. "Augustus, can you hear me? It's Horace!" For a moment, clarity seemed to return to Augustus's eyes. He focused on his brother's face, recognition dawning. "Horace," he whispered. "The plantation. Take care of everything. Don't trust." His words dissolved into a fit of coughing. Frothy blood speckled his lips. When the coughing subsided, panic filled his face again. "Ruth!" he gasped, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. "Ruth, don't leave me!" His fingers dug into her flesh with desperate strength. Ruth stood perfectly still, allowing the pain as Augustus Beaumont spoke her name one final time. His eyes locked with hers, not as master to slave, but as dying man to the keeper of his last moments. Then his grip loosened. The tension left his body all at once. His head fell back against the pillow, mouth slightly open, eyes staring at nothing. The room fell silent. "Augustus?" Horace shook his brother's shoulder. "Augustus!" Ruth reached forward and gently closed the dead man's eyes. "He's gone, Master Horace," she said quietly. Horace stood frozen for several seconds, staring at his brother's corpse. Then, like a dam breaking, fury erupted across his face. He whirled on Ruth, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What did you do to him?" he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "What poison did you use, you devil woman?" "None, master," Ruth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I used only healing herbs. The break was bad from the start. The infection—" "Don't speak to me of infection." Horace's fingers dug into her shoulders. "I saw how he called for you, how he depended on you. You used that, didn't you? You made him trust you while you killed him." Ruth said nothing, keeping her face blank despite the pain of his grip. Without evidence, without proof, her silence was her shield. A knock at the door interrupted Horace's rage. Grayson entered, taking in the scene with a quick glance. "The master is dead?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Horace released Ruth, straightening his coat. "Yes," informed the household. "And send for the undertaker." Grayson nodded, his eyes flicking to Ruth. The smallest smile played at the corner of his mouth before he turned and left. "Get out," Horace told Ruth, his voice suddenly cold and controlled. "Prepare my brother for burial with the other women. I'll deal with you later." Ruth bowed her head and left the room, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. In the hallway, she paused, steadying herself against the wall. It was done. After weeks of careful poisoning, Augustus Beaumont was dead. The man who had whipped her son, who had treated them all like animals, would never hurt anyone again. Word spread quickly through the quarters. By midday, every enslaved person on the plantation knew that the master was dead. They kept their faces appropriately solemn in the presence of whites, but when alone, whispers of relief passed between them. Ruth helped wash and dress Augustus's body, her hands steady as she prepared the man she had killed for his final rest. The other women avoided touching the rotting leg, but Ruth wrapped it carefully, hiding the evidence of her work. Only once, when the other women had stepped outside for fresh air, did Ruth allow herself to feel the triumph. A small, fleeting smile crossed her lips as she looked down at Augustus's gray face. Justice had been served slowly and deliberately by her own hands. That brief moment of satisfaction had to be enough. There would be consequences now. Dangers she had known would come. But for this one day, Augustus Beaumont was dead, and she had made it happen. As night fell across the plantation, Ruth sat with Samuel in their small cabin, holding him close. She had told him nothing directly, but the boy understood what had happened. "They're saying the master died of his wounds," Samuel whispered. "Is it true, Mama?" "Hush," she warned, though they were alone. "What's done is done." Before Samuel could reply, the door crashed open. Grayson stood there with two other overseers, lanterns casting long shadows behind them. "Ruth," Grayson said, his voice almost pleasant, "Master Horace requires your presence." Ruth stood slowly. "At this hour? Now?" Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Samuel jumped up. "Where are you taking her?" "Stay here, child," Ruth said firmly, but Samuel clutched her skirt. "No, Mama, don't go." One of the overseers stepped forward, grabbing Samuel roughly. The boy fought, kicking and screaming as they pulled him away from Ruth. "Don't hurt him!" Ruth cried, lunging forward, but Grayson caught her arms. "Come quietly, or it will be worse for him," he hissed in her ear. They marched her across the dark yard toward the main house. Instead of entering through the kitchen as usual, Grayson led her around to the cellar doors. A chill ran through Ruth as they descended the stone steps into the damp darkness below. Horace waited there, a single lamp illuminating his cold face. Without a word, he nodded to the overseers. They forced Ruth against a stone pillar, the rough surface scraping her back as iron shackles were locked around her wrists. From outside, she could hear Samuel's screams growing fainter as he was dragged away. "Where are they taking my son?" Ruth demanded, forgetting herself in her fear. Horace stepped closer, studying her face in the dim light. "Your son will remain alive as long as you are useful to me." "I've done nothing wrong," Ruth said. "We both know that's a lie." Horace's voice was soft, almost conversational. "I can't prove what you did to my brother, but I know. And now you'll serve me with the same dedication. Your herbs, your remedies, they're mine now. And if I even suspect you're using them against me—" He left the threat unfinished, but Ruth understood. Samuel's life hung in Horace's hands. "You'll stay here tonight," Horace continued, "to consider your position. Tomorrow, you'll begin tending to me. I've developed a troubling cough recently." His smile was cold as winter. "I'll expect your full attention to my health." He turned and climbed the stairs, the overseers following with the lamp, leaving Ruth alone in the pitch darkness, chained to the pillar, her son's distant cries fading to silence. Ruth awakened with a jolt, her body stiff from lying on the cold stone floor of the cellar. Darkness surrounded her, broken only by thin strips of moonlight filtering through cracks in the foundation. Her wrists throbbed where the iron shackles had rubbed her skin raw. She shifted, trying to find a position that might ease her pain, but the chains rattled loudly in the silence. Something skittered across the floor nearby. Rats. They had grown bolder as the night wore on, venturing closer to where she lay. Ruth pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller. The damp chill of the cellar had settled deep in her bones, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. They had given her no food, no water, since chaining her here. "Samuel," she whispered into the darkness, though she knew he couldn't hear. Her thoughts turned constantly to her son. Where had they taken him? Was he safe? The memory of his screams as they dragged him away haunted her. A soft scratching sound came from the far wall. Ruth tensed, thinking it was more rats, but then she heard it. The faintest whisper. "Mama!" Ruth's heart leaped. "Samuel!" she called softly, straining against her chains to move toward the sound. "I'm here, Mama," came his voice, slightly louder now. At the crack in the wall. Ruth crawled as far as her chains would allow, feeling her way toward the wall. Her fingers found a narrow gap between the stones where the mortar had crumbled away. Cool night air brushed her fingertips. "Samuel, are you hurt?" she asked urgently. "No, Mama. They put me back in our cabin." His voice trembled. "Master Horace. He's so angry. He whipped 2 men today just for looking at him wrong." Ruth closed her eyes, picturing her boy's face. "Listen to me. You stay out of his way. Don't draw attention. I brought you something," Samuel whispered. Ruth felt something small and leafy being pushed through the crack. "I went to your hiding place and got herbs." Ruth's fingers closed around the precious bundle. the very plants she'd used to poison Augustus. Her throat tightened with emotion at her son's bravery and quick thinking. "You're a good boy," she said. "But this was dangerous. If they caught you—" "They didn't," Samuel interrupted. "I was careful, like you taught me." Ruth clutched the herbs to her chest. "What else is happening? Tell me everything." Samuel's voice dropped even lower. "Master Horace ordered all the cabins searched. He's looking for your herbs, Mama. And he—" Samuel paused, his voice catching. "He told everyone that anyone helping you would be whipped to death." Ruth closed her eyes, digesting this news. Horace was isolating her, cutting off any support she might have. Smart. Dangerous. "The overseer, Mr. Grayson. He keeps watching me," Samuel continued, "following me around. I don't think he saw me come here, but—" "Samuel, go back now," Ruth said sharply. "It's too risky. I'll be all right. But go, please. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." She heard him hesitate. Then, "I'll come back tomorrow night. Be careful," she whispered. But Samuel was already gone, his footsteps fading into the night. Ruth crawled back to her spot against the pillar, concealing the herbs in the folds of her dress. She would save them. Wait for the right moment. Horace might have her chained, but he had no idea what weapons she still possessed. Hours passed. The cellar grew lighter as dawn approached. Ruth dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. When the cellar doors finally opened, she blinked against the sudden brightness. Heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Grayson appeared, carrying a wooden cup and a small piece of bread. "Well, well," he said, looking down at her with undisguised satisfaction. "Not so proud now, are you?" Ruth said nothing, keeping her eyes on the floor. Grayson set the cup and bread just within her reach. "Master Horace says you're to be fed. He wants you alive, at least for now." He crouched down, his face close to hers. "I told him I should keep a special eye on you." The smell of whiskey and sweat rolled off him. Ruth turned her face away. "Listen carefully," Grayson said, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. "I know what you did to Master Augustus. I've been watching you for weeks. Your little herb garden, your special bandages." He smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "I'm going to tell Master Horace everything, unless you make it worth my while to keep quiet." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "What do you want?" Grayson's eyes glinted. "That's better. First, I want some of those herbs you've been hiding, the ones that make a man stronger with a woman." His hand slid from her chin to her neck. "And later, when you're out of these chains, you'll do as I say. Otherwise, I go straight to Master Horace, and your boy gets the whip." Ruth forced herself to remain still, though inside she burned with fury. She memorized every word, every threat. This man would pay, just as Augustus had. "I understand," she said quietly. Grayson seemed disappointed by her quick submission. He had wanted her to fight, to give him an excuse. Instead, she stared at him with empty eyes. "Master Horace wants to see you this afternoon," he said, standing up. "Clean yourself up as best you can with that water. You look like death." After he left, Ruth ate the stale bread slowly, saving half for later. She sipped the water, using a little to wash her face and hands. The chains limited her movement, but she managed to make herself somewhat presentable. By midday, the cellar had grown stifling. Ruth's dress clung to her skin with sweat. When the doors opened again, 2 house servants came down to unlock her chains from the pillar. Her wrists remained shackled, but at least she could walk. They led her upstairs into the main house, through the kitchen where the cook avoided her eyes, and into the study where Horace waited. He sat behind a large desk, papers spread before him. "Leave us," he told the servants. When they were alone, Horace studied Ruth silently. She kept her head bowed, the picture of submission, while her mind raced. "My brother trusted you," Horace finally said. "That was his mistake." "I did everything I could for Master Augustus," Ruth replied softly. "Save your lies." Horace stood up, circling the desk. "From now on, you belong to me. You will use your herbs only as I direct. You will attend to my health with complete devotion. One mistake, one sign of treachery, and your son will suffer." Before Ruth could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy falling. Horace strode to the door, flinging it open. "What is going on out there?" he shouted. Samuel appeared suddenly in the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed. When he saw Ruth, he rushed toward her before anyone could stop him. "Mama!" he cried, throwing his arms around her waist. Ruth couldn't embrace him with her shackled hands, but she pressed her face against his hair, inhaling his familiar scent. "Samuel, what are you doing here?" "Get that boy out of here," Horace ordered. But Samuel spoke quickly. "Master Horace, you're needed. Master Whitfield from next door. He's injured. They're bringing him in now." Horace's face darkened. "Whitfield?" "Here?" He brushed past them into the hallway. Samuel looked up at Ruth, whispering urgently. Master Horace got in a fight with the neighbor. They were drinking and arguing about land. Master Horace has a big cut on his arm. It's all red and swollen. Ruth's mind raced, understanding immediately. An infected wound. A drunk, angry Horace. This could be exactly what she needed. Before she could respond, Grayson appeared in the doorway. "You!" he said, pointing at Samuel. "Get back to the fields." He grabbed the boy's arm roughly. "Don't hurt him," Ruth pleaded. Grayson smirked. "Remember our agreement," he whispered, then dragged Samuel away. From the front of the house came the sound of men arguing. Horace's voice rose above the others, slurred with drink. Then a crash, followed by cursing. Ruth stood alone in the study, her shackled hands clasped before her. Perhaps Horace's wound would provide the opportunity she needed, both for escape and for revenge. She would need to be patient, cautious. But one thing was certain. Horace Beaumont's days of power were numbered. The cellar door creaked open, flooding the dark space with harsh sunlight. Ruth squinted against the sudden brightness as two house servants descended the stairs. Without a word, they unlocked her chains from the pillar. "Master Horace wants you," one of them said flatly, avoiding her eyes. Ruth's legs buckled as she tried to stand. 3 days in the damp cellar had stiffened her joints. The servants grabbed her arms roughly, half dragging her up the stairs. The bright morning light stabbed at her eyes as they pulled her across the yard. From the fields, she caught a glimpse of Samuel watching, fear plain on his face. She gave him the smallest nod, a signal to stay where he was, to keep working, to remain invisible. Inside the main house, the smell of rich food and polished wood replaced the cellar's moldy dampness. They led her upstairs to Horace's bedroom. Ruth steeled herself, hiding her thoughts behind a mask of blank submission. Horace sat propped up in his large bed, sweat beading on his forehead. His right arm was wrapped in a dirty bandage, blood and yellow fluid seeping through. The room reeked of whiskey and infection. "Leave us!" Horace barked at the servants. When the door closed, he fixed Ruth with bloodshot eyes. "You're going to fix this," he said, gesturing to his arm. Ruth moved closer, examining the bandage. "May I look at the wound, Master Horace?" He thrust his arm toward her. "The fool Whitfield slashed me with his knife. Claimed I was cheating at cards." He laughed bitterly. "No doctor for 50 miles, and I don't trust those quacks anyway." Ruth carefully unwrapped the bandage. The wound beneath was angry red, the edges swollen and hot. Pus oozed from the 4-inch gash. The infection had set in deep. "This needs cleaning and proper dressing," she said quietly. "I'll need my herbs." "I had them brought from your quarters," Horace said, nodding toward a small basket on the table. "Grayson says you've been hiding things. If I find out you're using anything that might harm me—" He let the threat hang in the air. As if summoned by his name, Grayson appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed over his chest, watching Ruth with a smirk. "Make sure she doesn't try anything," Horace told him. "Watch what she puts on my arm." "Yes, sir," Grayson replied, never taking his eyes off Ruth. He coughed roughly, clearing his throat. "Been keeping an eye on her for weeks now." Ruth moved to the table, examining the herbs in the basket. Her mind worked quickly. They'd collected most of her regular healing plants, but had missed the small pouch of deadlier herbs that Samuel had slipped her in the cellar. She kept it hidden in the folds of her dress. "I need hot water and clean cloths," she said. Grayson nodded at a basin already set up nearby. "Everything's there. Get to work." Ruth washed her hands, then began preparing a poultice. She worked deliberately, aware of Grayson watching her every move. She ground some harmless herbs, chamomile, yarrow, comfrey, letting him see everything she did. "This will draw out the infection," she explained, keeping her voice steady and professional. When Grayson turned his head to cough again, Ruth quickly slipped a pinch of her hidden herbs into the mixture. Not enough to kill quickly. That would be too obvious. Just enough to weaken, to worsen whatever was already wrong with Horace's body. "Your cough sounds bad," she remarked to Grayson, not looking up from her work. "Just dust," he said dismissively, but coughed again, harsher this time. Ruth cleaned Horace's wound carefully, hiding her satisfaction when he winced in pain. She applied the poultice, then wrapped it with fresh bandages. "It will take time to heal," she told him. "The infection is deep." Horace examined her work suspiciously. "If this gets worse instead of better, your boy will pay the price. Remember that." "I understand, Master Horace." Ruth kept her eyes downcast. "The dressing should be changed again tonight." Grayson coughed again, the sound rattling in his chest. Ruth glanced at him, then back to her herbs on the table. "I could make something for that cough," she offered casually. "It sounds like it's getting worse." Grayson straightened. "I don't need your witch remedies." "Let her make it," Horace ordered, settling back against his pillows. "Your coughing is driving me mad. Besides, if she tries to poison you, we'll know not to trust her with my arm." He laughed cruelly. Grayson's expression soured, but he nodded. "Fine." Ruth turned back to the table, her heart beating faster. This was an unexpected opportunity. She selected different herbs this time, mint and honey to mask the taste, then slipped in a larger dose of her poisonous herbs when both men were distracted by Horace adjusting his bandage. She mixed the concoction with water from the basin, warming it slightly over the small fireplace in the room. The honey dissolved, releasing a sweet smell that covered the bitter poison beneath. "Drink it while it's warm," she said, handing the cup to Grayson. "It will soothe your throat." Grayson sniffed the liquid suspiciously. "Smells sweet." "That's the honey," Ruth explained. "It helps coat the throat." Horace waved impatiently. "Just drink it, Grayson. I need to rest." Grayson raised the cup to his lips. "To your health," he said mockingly to Ruth. Ruth watched, her face carefully blank, as he took a long swallow. His eyes widened slightly at the pleasant taste, and he drank more deeply. His throat worked as he swallowed the mixture, draining the cup. "Not bad," he admitted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He seemed pleased with himself, confident in his power over her. The poison would take time to work, hours, perhaps a day. By then, no one would connect his illness to the remedy. "You may go now," Horace told Ruth, "but you'll be kept in the kitchen, not the cellar. I want you close when I need you." "Yes, Master Horace," Ruth replied, gathering her herbs. As she turned to leave, Grayson caught her arm. "Remember our arrangement," he whispered, his face close to hers. "I'll be visiting you tonight." Ruth nodded meekly. "I'll be waiting," she lied, knowing he would never make it to nightfall. She left the room with her head bowed, the empty cup still clutched in Grayson's hand. Behind her mask of submission, a cold satisfaction spread through her heart. The poison had been delivered. Now, she only needed to wait. 3 days after Ruth administered the first poisoned dressing, Horace's condition began to change. The fever came in the night, a slow heat that painted his cheeks red and glazed his eyes. Ruth stood by his bedside, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. She wore the same concerned expression she had used with Augustus, a perfect mask of care that hid the satisfaction underneath. "The wound is healing," she lied, looking at the festering gash on his arm. "But you've caught a fever. It happens sometimes with deep cuts." Horace stared at her through narrowed eyes. "You're doing something," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, suspicious, same as with Augustus. Ruth shook her head. "No, Master Horace. I'm trying to help you get well." He tried to sit up, but fell back against the pillows, too weak to rise. "I'll have you whipped if I don't improve by tomorrow." "Yes, Master Horace," she said quietly, rewrapping his arm with fresh bandages, bandages she had prepared with the same poison that had taken Augustus. The poison worked slowly, building in the body day by day, impossible to detect until it was too late. Outside in the hallway, she heard a violent coughing fit. Grayson's condition was worsening faster than Horace's. The overseer had taken to his bed the previous day, unable to stand without dizziness. His cough tore through his chest, bringing up blood that he tried to hide from the other overseers. Ruth slipped from Horace's room and moved quickly down the back stairs to the kitchen. Samuel waited for her there, his eyes anxious but determined. "Is it working?" he whispered, when no one else was near. Ruth nodded once. "Both of them are failing. Grayson faster than the master." Samuel's small shoulders straightened with pride. He had been Ruth's faithful helper, smuggling herbs from their hiding places, watching for guards, listening for news. At 12 years old, he understood more than any child should about survival and revenge. "I showed Martha how to make the sleeping tea," he said quietly, "like you told me to." Ruth squeezed his hand. Good. The knowledge must spread. She had begun teaching other enslaved women which herbs healed and which could harm. Knowledge was power, perhaps the only power they might keep when this was over. That evening, Grayson didn't appear for dinner. One of the house servants whispered that he was coughing up so much blood they'd had to change his sheets twice. No doctor had been called. Horace was too sick himself to give the order, and no one else dared spend the master's money. By the 5th day, Horace couldn't leave his bed. His skin had taken on a yellow tinge, and the veins in his eyes had burst, turning the whites red. He alternated between sweating fevers and violent chills. "You're poisoning me," he accused Ruth during a moment of clarity. "Just like Augustus." "You're very ill, Master Horace," Ruth replied calmly. "The infection has spread to your blood." "Liar!" he tried to shout, but his voice broke into a weak gasp. "Get the other overseers. Tell them what she's doing to me." The house servant who stood nearby shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Grayson is too sick to come, Master, and Mr. Phillips left yesterday. Said he had business in town." The truth was that the overseers had begun to abandon the plantation. With both Augustus dead and Horace failing, they saw no reason to stay. Some had already stolen what they could carry and disappeared in the night. On the 7th day, Ruth entered Horace's room to find him thrashing weakly against the sheets, his eyes wild with fever. "Witch!" he moaned when he saw her. "Devil woman! You've killed us all." Ruth approached the bed calmly. "I'm here to change your dressing, Master Horace." "No!" he cried, trying to pull away. "Don't touch me!" But he was too weak to resist as she unwrapped his arm. The wound had turned black at the edges, the flesh around it swollen and hot. "You see?" he whispered. "You see what you've done?" Ruth looked into his eyes. For the first time, she let her mask slip. "I see justice," she said quietly, "for my son's scars, for Augustus's cruelty, for every lash and chain." Understanding dawned in Horace's feverish eyes. "You admit it?" "Only to you," Ruth said, "and you'll be dead before you can tell anyone." That night, Horace Beaumont died screaming about poisoned bandages and treacherous slaves. No one paid attention to his ravings. The mad words of a dying man meant nothing. By morning, his body was cold. The news spread through the plantation like wildfire. Samuel brought word to Ruth as she stood in the kitchen garden. "The master's dead," he whispered, "and Grayson died an hour ago." Ruth nodded, looking out toward the fields. Already she could see movement. Enslaved people walking away from their work, gathering in small groups, talking in voices that no longer bothered to stay hushed. Without Horace or the overseers to maintain order, chaos erupted swiftly. By midday, someone had broken into the main house. By evening, the accounting books and slave ledgers had been thrown into a bonfire in the yard. Smoke rose from the overseer's cabin. Someone had set it ablaze. The flames caught quickly, spreading to nearby buildings. No one tried to stop the fire. As darkness fell, Ruth took Samuel's hand. "It's time to go," she said softly. They walked together away from the quarters where they had lived their entire lives. Around them, other enslaved people were doing the same, gathering what little they owned, joining family members, disappearing into the night. The sky behind them glowed orange with the burning buildings. Ruth didn't look back as they walked toward the tree line at the edge of the property. The weight of the poison pouch in her pocket was gone now. She had used the last of it on Horace's final bandage. Samuel's hand was warm in hers. His steps, hesitant at first, grew more confident as they moved farther from the plantation. "Where are we going?" he asked. "North," Ruth answered. "As far as we can." They reached the edge of the woods, where the darkness would swallow them and hide their escape. Behind them, the plantation that had been their prison continued to burn, casting long shadows ahead of them. Ruth squeezed Samuel's hand. "No more chains," she whispered. Samuel squeezed back. Together, they stepped into the darkness, leaving behind the ashes of their captivity and walking toward something neither of them had ever known: freedom. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.